Well, hello, everyone. It's great to have a few folks here and to talk about how to make competitive intelligence a more manageable function. We're using the Agile framework to enable that, and I'm excited to talk to you all about that. A little bit background about myself. I'm Alan Armstrong. I founded Eigenworks just over 10 years ago, and I did so after about 15 years in B2B software product management, including a stint doing various things at a public company. It used to be called Sybase, and then through 3 startups from mid-stage through exit. Along the way, I found I was mostly doing product management, product marketing, some corporate development, business development, sales. And I found that insights about buyers were both the scarcest of insights that we had, and also the most valuable. And that's why I started this company. Along the way, I've met dozens of people who are managing and trying to manage market intelligence and competitive intelligence functions. And we hear a lot of things, a lot of reactive sort of feelings, a lot of pressure coming at the competitive intelligence function from the field. You know, sales wants their silver bullets, and they want them now. They want to know that there's one feature that we have that nobody else has, and if I just lay down that feature every time, I'm going to win, you know, over half the time. And so we get these questions coming to us for battle cards and competitive research, and it can be a very reactive function. And so we feel a little bit like we're reacting to sales panic and going into a project-based competitive intelligence function that's based on a specific competitor and is focused on features, product features. And the result of a lot of that approach and that behavior is that we end up chasing our competitors. In fact, you know, I have lots of experience in my own life, and you might be able to point to some as well, where, you know, we hear for months and months that we're missing this one feature or these 2 features. And of course, when we ship those features, our win rate doesn't change. And so we feel like we're just playing catch up in the competitive field. So Agile is a framework that can help. Agile is both a mindset and a method. As a mindset, it embraces uncertainty and experimentation and human values. It's a very non-hierarchical sort of mindset. As a method, it's a method of breaking things down into large tasks and seemingly massive tasks into smaller, manageable chunks of work that can be done incrementally. The wheel that I'm showing here is from a movement called Modern Agile. It emerged a couple of years ago after about 15 or 16 years of the original Agile manifesto, which was developed by some very hardcore software engineers. And it was a great manifesto and led to a ton of productivity and just better way of delivering software. But after 15 years or so of experience, the industry and the practice has matured. And this modern Agile wheel is a very helpful one. So we can talk about 4 components of the wheel, and we're going to translate those into the world of competitive intelligence today. So the first principle is to make people awesome. Talk about what that means. Agile is all about delivering value continuously, as opposed to in large waterfall kinds of ways. We make safety a prerequisite, and we'll talk about what that means, but it's not like workplace safety in the sense of manufacturing. It's more intellectual and emotional safety in the sense that we're allowed to make mistakes. And that also leads to the 4th principle, which is to experiment and learn rapidly. And so we've taken the modern Agile framework and then said, how would we adapt or translate those principles into the world of competitive and market intelligence? And so I want to talk to you about that. I'm going to show you all 17 screens that I've got. The first, to talk about delivering value continuously. In the world of CI and MI, value is encoded in insights. So we want to create a practice where we are continually delivering insights to the business and to our consumers. Second, to make safety a prerequisite, it's important to establish a collaborative environment where insights are visible and we seek evidence, so that what wins will be based on what has the most evidence to support it, as opposed to whose business card is biggest or who's voting for the idea. Experimenting and learning rapidly means being able to respond to the emerging questions that are coming out of a changing business environment, sales, and competitive environment. And finally, the thing that I'm going to spend some time talking about today primarily is that making people awesome really means making your buyer awesome in the world of competitive intelligence. And I want to talk about how that changes the conversation. The other part of making people awesome is creating empowered teams and giving teams the authority and that it takes to investigate competitive situations, rather than hiding information or lodging all of account control inside of the sales team. Okay, so ultimately, so there's the high-level picture of Agile. Now, ultimately, if you're going to adopt an Agile approach, you want to end up with what we're seeing here. This is called a Kanban board. I love being in a room where I can ask people to raise their hands. My colleague Chris is here, and I'm not sure if we can raise hands here and how many people are using a Kanban or have heard of a Kanban, but maybe you can start to type that into the chat. This is an example Kanban that we developed with one of our clients that's in the fundraising space. So there's something specific about fundraising in here. But you can apply this to your particular market or even an individual market segment. And so the aspects of a Kanban board are phases of individual tasks. So we have a backlog. So we can just put all of our ideas in the backlog. I'm an idea generator, and I love the backlog. In fact, I think some of my colleagues, would like to just give me way bigger backlogs, so that but then keep the number of things that move forward a little bit small. The second column is ready. These are the things that we're ready to work on, and so we might start doing some preparation to work on those. Third column is doing. These are the things we're working on actively right now. And then we have a column for done to show the kind of progress that we've had. So those are the columns and stages of individual tasks. Kanban also has these horizontal lines that are called swim lanes, if you hear about that. Tasks swim down the lane, the individual lane. So I like to, and so we divided this up into buyer intelligence, competitor intelligence, donor intelligence. You might call this the customer of your customer intelligence. If you're in a B2B to C market, that'd be the C. And internal fact finding, because there's a lot of wisdom and intelligence inside of every company. And so if you can start to think of the questions you have according to those kinds of categories, you can start to line up questions in the backlog. And then competitive intelligence and an agile approach is really a process of prioritizing those questions and then moving them forward. So you might hear agile software developers talk and think about user stories. That's a user story gets written on a sticky. And then sticky gets put on the board. This would be put onto a whiteboard. And then we would just write stickies for all of our user stories that we want to enable. And then one of the main tasks of the product owner in the software world is prioritizing the backlog and developing the user stories so that they can be worked on when appropriate. So for the competitive intelligence world, we translate that idea of user stories into research questions. And so what we want to start doing, if we're going to implement an Agile CI approach, is to start developing research questions that can be put into the backlog and then categorized according to the swim lane. Okay, so that's our goal, is to create this kind of categorized Kanban. The next thing is to say, okay, then over a course of a year, how might this program look if I was to implement this if I'm you and I want to implement this at my company? What might it look like? And so we just sketched out a picture of a year to show an example. So we might say, okay, we're going to work on getting the program developed here and maybe do a workshop with some internal people. We want to layer in some responsive capacity so that when hot topics come up, we can either interview buyers or do some hot topic research. We want to have a phase of optimizing the programs. And then we talk about gathering research questions into something called an epic. So again, this comes out of the world of software development. An epic in the world of literature is a big story. That's what an epic is. And so even though I think, what is it? The kids today, everything is epic, right? But an epic in this world is a really big story. And we can think of it as a collection of user stories. For a research epic, what we want to do is gather some research questions that are related enough and for whom the target market segment is related enough that we can get a lot done in that area. And then perform a series of sprints to develop and deliver insights around that particular epic or large research question. So your program doesn't have to look like this. This is just one example of one that we put together to show what it might look like. Okay, in the background here, the photo in the background is actually a whiteboard of one of our clients, and in their development shop, this is their Kanban, and this is their story room in the development world. So a picture of that, and that's what we're trying to drive towards, is a backlog that looks something like that, or a Kanban board that looks like that. So how do we get there? So my contention is that if we want to adapt Agile to competitive intelligence, we need two things. First of all, we need a simplifying function. And second, we need a prioritizing function. And I think it's best to simplify first and then prioritize. So I want to propose a couple of ways, or a few ways of thinking about that. The first is that focusing on the buyer is the biggest thing you can do to simplify all of your work. And so it's a bit like decluttering the house or purging my closet, which I actually did very recently. But purging the closet is such a great thing, because then all of a sudden the things you need are just right there and nothing else is there. Simplifying by focusing on buyer needs is a way to do that. And then I want to talk about, so once we've simplified, decluttered our closet, we have 4 prioritizing functions. So we're going to end up with a list of research questions. How do we make sure that we're working on the most important things? And then I'm going to pick one of those called the customer journey and use that to help you focus which kinds of decisions you'll be looking at. Okay, so let's talk first about simplifying CI. Most competitive intelligence focuses on competitors. I want to say that again. Competitive intelligence focuses on competitors. When I started out doing competitive intelligence, it's longer ago than I care to mention, almost 20 years. It was all about downloading our competitor product, getting a hold of documentation. We even used to decompile their product and figure out how they were doing and achieving certain things. And we would walk through their documentation and learn all of their features and functions. And then we would line up in columns and say, here's what we do, here's what they do, where are the checks and X's? And then in some ways, the roadmap wasn't always just about that, but a larger portion of our development activity was focused on catching up with that grid of things. And we would hear, because we started off with sales panic. I know whereof I speak here. This is a personal experience. Sales comes in and says, we got a big problem. So we go in and find out whether the competitor claims are true. Oh, look, they actually do have that feature. Then we go build it. We sell it, we market it, and it was very expensive activities. And what we end up with is an incomplete solution and an undifferentiated market. This is something we talk to our clients a lot about. What is your differentiation? Not are you as good as everybody else, but do you do different things? And studying competitors is not really a way to distance yourself from them. It's not to say you shouldn't understand your competitors, because know thy enemy is a perhaps a very important phrase, I think, in competitive and market intelligence. It's just that I don't want you to start with your competitor. So let's turn this around. How can we turn this around? So with apologies to Simon Sinek, who wrote a book called Start With Why, I want to propose that we in market intelligence and CI and product marketing, or wherever you sit, should start with buy, or to be a little bit more specific, start with your buyer. So as I said earlier, focusing on the buyer decision is a hugely simplifying function. You can eliminate competitor noise, you can stop copying features, and you can start addressing buyer problems. So instead of the cycle that we saw before, where we started with a competitor, we want to start with our market segment and move into buyer research and understand our buyers. And then once we understand what's important to our buyers, then we can look at our competitors. And that little switch will save you a whole bunch of time and make your efforts a lot more directed. Important. So this is the shift from a competitor first, competitive CI function to a buyer first or buyer centric function. And I propose that can help you shift also from starting with sales panic, doing project-based reactive work and chasing your competitors, to a world where you can be buyer centric and start with strategic research questions. Move into an ongoing program that is buyer-centric and lead towards a differentiated product that can command a price premium and actually excite your buyers. Okay, so that's the first goal, is for simplifying function, is to move towards a buyer focus. Now I want to talk about, okay, we got a buyer focus, we've simplified everything, we've cleared out our closet. How do we prioritize all the many questions that we have? Just going to pause for a second. I see a couple of chats. Are we all okay? Everything good? Okay, great. If you do have questions, there are a couple of us in the room here, so feel free to add your questions here, and Christine will be writing them for me on the whiteboard behind, and we can maybe prioritize that backlog when we get to it. Okay, so over the course of these webinars and some articles that we're writing, I want to put forward 4 prioritizing functions for competitive intelligence. So those include land expand questions, or are your buyers crashing or escaping? There's big picture questions. What are the biggest risks and opportunities in your business? Strategic assumptions. What assumptions already exist, and how can we test those? And then funnel questions, and looking at the shape of your funnel, and I think that can happen at customer acquisition time, as well as customer retention and growth time. So we don't have, well, we'll be covering these topics over time. I was going to say we don't have the time today. We have just the right amount of time to cover one of these prioritizing functions today. And I want to talk about prioritizing function 1, which I call the land expand diagnostic, or diagnosing the buyer journey. So I'm going to talk about land and expand, but I wonder if, while I'm at it, those of you who have figured out the chat function can write into the chat about whether your company is using land and expand as a sales approach, or whether you have something slightly different. I found companies that are creating things. Well, we're not exactly land and expand, we're seed and feed, or I don't know, I can't think of the other rhyming couplets. But land and expand is very common in the world of subscription selling, where the initial install or onboarding is fairly simple, and the idea is to make small proof of value and then move to a larger deployment. And then a lot of SaaS vendors pioneered that approach. And as we move to a world where everything is delivered as a service, land and expand, I think, can become the dominant go-to-market approach. Getting any responses? Okay, crickets. Well, just tell us what is your rhyming couplet for land and expand? Okay. All right, so to start out with, I want to talk about the layer model. This is land, adopt, expand, renew. This was first put forward and developed by TSIA, some really interesting thinkers over there. And you can look that up, Technology Services Industry Association. Really a great organization. Anyway, they put this land and expand idea out in the world, and it truly did expand or went viral on its own. A lot of companies are using this. So the idea is that, you know, the initial sale does not have to be a huge sale. We can get in small, show value, and then expand our footprint with our client. And it's a more fair approach for everybody. You know, I certainly remember the days, and some of you will as well, of, you know, massive, we used to call it whale hunting. I don't like the word so much from an animal perspective, but we used to call it whale hunting, where it was like all about the big multi-million-dollar purchase. And then a lot of those licenses went unused. And frankly, as the vendor, we didn't care. Well, we cared, but we got all the revenue from it. This is a slightly more equitable arrangement where you pay for what you use, and it's more of a utilization-based approach. And it leads to a sales model and a customer success model like this, land and expand. So what we've depicted here on the outer ring is the journey of the buyer, of the vendor. So the yellow person there is the vendor, that's you. Now, one of the things when I talk to companies about land and expand, I ask the question when I see their diagram for land and expand, where is your buyer in this picture? And I feel like I could just do a little mic drop at that point. Fact is that land and expand is named after your goals as a vendor, not after the buyer's goals or the user's goals. So our next step in developing this diagnostic tool was to overlay the journey of the buyer. So now we have our blue buyer in the middle, blue and green buyer in the middle. And they are starting out in the middle there in something that we call the current state or their prior state. This is their old way of doing things. They're orbiting this planet with a lot of gravitational pull called the status quo. This is the way we do things. We do things this way. We have these problems. We have these successes. We try something different, but then we get resistance and we go back to the old way of doing things. And it's just a cycle. And a lot of us can identify with that in our personal lives and our business lives. My contention is that when someone buys a large piece of technology or large product or service, that there's usually an individual within the organization that says, I've had enough of the old way of doing things. We need to do something in a new way. And that's in a way, that's why I call it the hero's journey of the buyer as hero. That person gets what I call escape velocity, and they leave the old orbit, the old planet, and they put on their jetpack and they get a vision for change. And then they're out in an outer orbit, and they're starting to look at new possibilities and new ideas. Okay, and that is when they end up in your land cycle. That's when they become a lead for you. They're usually a marketing qualified lead, an MQL, or a sales accepted lead, or whatever term you use for it. So once the buyer journey in blue converges with your vendor journey in yellow, then we have some interesting dynamics. And from there, your buyer can take one of three paths. They can continue along the green path and become your customer. That's what we call a win. They can leave that path and you know, that planet entirely and escape. We call it an escape or a competitive loss, and they'll start orbiting the planet of a competitor, or they'll lose momentum and just crash back to their old way of doing things. And I call that a crash, sometimes called a no decision or long push. These are deals that are forecasted to close, and then they don't close, and then they're forecasted again to close, and they don't close, and they keep getting forecasted to close. It's very rare that a lot of, well, it depends on the sales team, but there can be a culture of that's never a loss, even though the customer is no longer considering you anymore. Anyway, that's a no decision. So that's at customer acquisition time. Let's talk about the paths at retention time. So at this part of the cycle, we should be showing value and expanding our footprint. And sometimes we do that, in which case, you know, our customer remains usually on a green path, and they'll grow and they'll become advocates for our product or service. But of course, we're going to have churn as well, and customer cancellations and downgrades. And some customers just never get off the ground, and so they go back to their old way of doing things again, and they don't say, hey, enough of that approach. I'm going back to the way we did it, as painful as it was. And others will find another solution that's a better fit for them, and they'll escape your orbit and again become competitors, customers of your competitors, and we call that a competitive churn escape. So I offer this model for a few reasons. The first is that I think it gives a visual, and the feedback we've been getting is it gives a visual way for companies, product managers, product marketers, sales teams, executive teams to look at the entire cycle and go, this is where I think we have questions. This is where we have problems. Here's where we have opportunities. And so you can start to develop a heat map of what people care about and what kinds of things you want to look into. The second thing is it points out a lot of really interesting decision types. And remember, I said that the first and most, the biggest simplifying action that you can take is to focus on buyer decisions. So here are 6 different types of buyer decisions that you can focus on. You know, sometimes we work with companies who say, look, we've got some people who are they just stay with us forever with very little intervention. What is it that makes those people successful? Should we study those? Is that our biggest opportunity? Or, you know, we're earlier in our cycle and we're just struggling to gain customers and they're having no decisions. Usually that ends up with a weirdly shaped funnel. So we would look at no decisions or crashes. So this gives you 6 decision types to study, and usually we recommend studying those in combination. And this will add a lot of richness and simplicity to your overall efforts. And so starting on the first types of decisions, we have wins and losses and no decisions. Here are some questions that you can address. It's really interesting to look at wins and interview wins. A lot of companies say, we know why we win. You know, we have great salespeople and our demo is awesome. But actually, in our experience, having interviewed several thousand buyers, a lot of times there's more competitive intelligence that can come out of speaking to your wins because they've critically evaluated you and said, this mattered, this didn't. Sometimes we discover that a vendor was this close to losing a deal when they thought it was a slam dunk. So it's very insightful to do that. A lot of people say they want to diagnose losses. Wins can actually provide just as much or more insight. The question with losses is really, was it a winnable deal? Was there something that they were uninformed about? Are salespeople equipped? Or should this maybe have been a disqualified opportunity to start with? And then no decision, we're looking for ways to either help people get over that hump or potentially just go back to a nurture phase. Similarly, at retention time, there are 3 journeys that you can study here. I think it's really important to study the journey. So we're not asking, when you're studying buyer decisions, you don't want to ask just questions about why did you do this or why did you do that. You really want to understand what was the context that led up to this decision, because that will inform and make sense of a lot of the downstream decisions. And so there are 3 types of questions you can ask here: expand, renew, and advocate questions. What were the impacts that you had on their business, the customer outcomes? What parts of the journey were difficult and how did they overcome those? That's really fascinating. So you can double down on those parts of your customer success function that are really working, or your product enablement. Competitive churns, where do we fall down? How do we improve? And failure to thrive, you know, is this a customer that we can even retain, or is there something we need to fix? So there's an overview of one prioritization function, looking at the buyer journey and identifying 6 types of buyer decisions that can help you prioritize what you want to look at. If you wanted to turn this into a study, here's a guide that we would recommend. I think it's important to start off by collecting hypotheses. I like to say to all of my stakeholders, look, we all have our own beliefs. I want to understand everybody's beliefs, not so that I can go out and confirm your incorrect belief, but rather so that I can go out and help us all test all of our beliefs. If you are doing direct interviews or qualitative research, you need to identify a cohort of about 20 customers or non-customers or wins and losses to speak to. There are ways of compelling them to speak to you, and then just get in there. I think a lot of product managers, product marketers, and CI people would have great conversations if only they had more conversations. And then, of course, once you get on the phone, there are ways to improve that approach, and we'll be talking about that in some future webinars as well. Finally, I think it's important to share your results as widely as possible. If you have incriminating aspects or egregious behavior by some team members, it's probably best to redact that, but everything else should be shared. And that's really a cultural question for your company. Okay, I'm gonna move past the interviewing guide, and we'll probably cover that in more detail another time. Let's talk about how to activate the insights, and then we're gonna get to some questions. So I encourage you to start asking questions now in the chat area. Are we getting some chats, Chris? No. Okay. Hopefully folks are still with us. Maybe raise your hand or type a little note, say hi, Chris, in there, or start typing your questions, because in a moment I'll be able to address those. So then the next question is, how do I actually help turn these things into action for my company? The first thing is that I want to pull together a team of progressive minds. Another way to look at this is that I want to create a coalition of the willing. I want to find those people in my company who are really open to listening to ways that we need to improve. They're all, in every department, there are people who are just heads down, I just have my job to do. And there are those who are thinking more about how can we do things in a more thoughtful, progressive way. Try to curate a group like that. Second is to walk through stories individually and walk through them with your constituents. You want to understand the parts of a buyer journey, and you want to deliver these in a continuous way so as a group you can start to build up an understanding of your buyer. And then once you've collected enough of these stories and start to see some themes emerging, you can look for actions. What are the things that customer success can do, that marketing can do to attract the right kind of customer profile? How can we sharpen our personas using these buyer studies? How can sales? I love working with sales. Sales is really at the front line and has more conversations with customers every day than most of the rest of the company combined. But sales conversations are not necessarily transparent conversations with a buyer. They can be dialogue, but there's an interesting dynamic that goes on there. So we really have to give salespeople the tools that we can glean from more candid conversations about buyer decisions across the entire market. And then, of course, product. I want to look at those aspects of product where we can, maybe the product can do some things that our support team shouldn't need to do. So I've tried today to introduce Agile and show that it is an approach that can help you get ahead of the game. And I suggested that you have to simplify things, and then that you need to prioritize things. And there are some prioritizing functions that can help. Today, we focused on land and expand questions. We'll be developing some additional webinars in the future where we talk about funnel questions, strategic assumptions, and I think we'll have a special guest for that discussion, as well as big picture questions. Okay. So again, my name is Alan Armstrong. I was really delighted that so many of you joined today, and I would love to engage in any questions you would have.
just to know, we've also opened up the audio channel, so if you have a question, you can.
All right, the audio is open as well. Great, thanks, Matt. So just pipe up. Oh, and I'm also aware that we have a bunch of CI people on the phone who may not want to pipe up. Sometimes we're a secretive bunch. I feel like anybody ever see that show Polka Dot Door? I see Peter, I see Melissa, I see Kara, I see Jack. Okay. Well, somebody's phoning my cell phone, so maybe they have a really urgent question. Okay. Well, listen, I'm sure that there's a lot of thought going on out there. Maybe some email, maybe some lunch. If you have any questions that have emerged or which emerge as you think about all this, I really would love to hear from you. So you can send us an email, info@eigenworks.com, or submit a question to our website, and we love to hear from you.